They called her a monster, but monsters don't stand that still when the world turns against them. And she didn't move, not an inch. Not even when the wind kicked dust across the platform and settled into the folds of her strange, pale clothing. Not even when the murmurs grew louder and heavier, pressing in from every side like heat before a storm, because she was small, no more than 5 feet tall. Her wrists bound in a way that looked more symbolic than necessary, as if the people watching needed to believe she could be dangerous, needed something to justify the fear in their eyes. And above her the light burned white and steady, artificial, humming faintly like a distant engine that never slept, casting sharp shadows across a square that had seen too many judgments and not enough truth. And still she said nothing, her eyes moving slowly across the crowd, not searching for escape, not begging for mercy, just watching, as if she were trying to understand a language no one had bothered to teach her. And maybe that was the first thing that should have felt wrong, but no one noticed, or maybe they did and chose not to. Because it was easier that way, easier to stand shoulder to shoulder and repeat the same quiet certainty, that she was dangerous, that she didn't belong, that whatever had happened out beyond the ridge must have been her doing, even though no one could quite agree on what that was. 3 men gone missing, a signal lost, a patrol that never came back, stories that shifted depending on who told them, but all pointing in one direction, all ending here, with her, standing alone beneath a sky that didn't feel like it belonged to her any more than the ground beneath her feet did. And somewhere in that crowd a man shifted his weight, boots scraping lightly against the packed dirt, a small sound swallowed almost immediately by the low hum of voices. But he heard it, and more than that, he felt the silence wrapped around her, the kind of silence that wasn't empty but waiting, like something unfinished. And his name was Caleb Ward. And he had ridden 30 miles through dry land and broken stone to get here, not because anyone asked him to, not because he believed the stories, but because something in them didn't sit right, something too clean, too easy, like a conclusion reached before the question was ever asked. And now he stood at the edge of the crowd, hat low, eyes steady, taking in the details others ignored, the way her shoulders didn't tense, the way her breathing stayed slow and even, the way her gaze never fixed on any one face long enough to show fear. And then there was the thing at her throat, a small piece of metal or glass or something in between, dull against her skin, almost invisible unless you were looking for it. And Caleb didn't know why his eyes kept returning to it, only that it didn't belong in a place like this, not among ropes and raised voices and decisions made too quickly. And someone near the front called out for it to be finished, their voice cracking with a kind of urgency that sounded more like relief than anger. And another voice followed, louder, sharper, and then more, building into something that filled the square, pushing forward, demanding an ending. Because endings are easier than questions, and Caleb felt the weight of that, the pull of it, the way a crowd can decide something simply by wanting it badly enough. And for a moment he almost turned away, almost let it happen the way things so often did out here, fast and final and unquestioned. But then she looked at him, not directly, not in a way anyone else would notice, just a slight shift of her eyes, catching his presence at the edge of everything. And there was no fear there, none at all, only something quieter, something that felt like recognition without understanding. And that was the moment that stopped him, not the rope, not the voices, not the heat, but the absence of fear in someone who should have had every reason to feel it. And Caleb stepped forward before he fully realized he was moving. One step, then another, the crowd parting just enough out of instinct or surprise, boots pressing into the dirt with a steady rhythm that didn't match the chaos around him. And he didn't reach for his weapon, didn't raise his voice. He just walked, slow and certain, until he stood where everyone could see him, where the noise faltered just slightly, enough to let a single question cut through, simple, plain, impossible to ignore. Did anyone hear her speak? And the words hung there, heavier than they should have been, because no one had asked that, not once. And for the first time since it began, something shifted, small but real, like a crack in something that had seemed solid a moment before. And the girl remained still, silent as ever, the faint hum of the light above blending with something else now, something softer, almost hidden, a signal too weak to be noticed unless you were listening for it. And Caleb realized, with a certainty that settled deep in his chest, that whatever was happening here wasn't the end of a story. It was the beginning of one no one else had taken the time to hear. The question did not fade the way most words do in a crowd. It lingered, settling into the spaces between people, into the cracks of certainty they had built for themselves. And no one answered, not because they could not, but because answering would mean admitting they had never tried. And Caleb could see it in their faces, the way eyes shifted, the way shoulders tightened, the way certainty began to loosen its grip just enough to make room for doubt. And doubt was dangerous here, more dangerous than any outsider they could tie to a post and judge before sunset. And the man nearest the platform cleared his throat, trying to reclaim control of something that was already slipping, saying she did not need to speak, saying they had seen enough, heard enough, decided enough. But his voice lacked the weight it carried only moments before, and Caleb did not raise his own voice to challenge him, did not step closer in anger. He simply turned his head slightly toward the girl again, watching the way she held herself, the stillness that was not resignation but restraint, like someone holding back a tide that no one else could see. And then he noticed it again, that faint sound beneath everything else, a thin thread of vibration that did not belong to wind or machinery, something rhythmic, deliberate, and the device at her throat pulsed once, so softly it could have been imagined. But Caleb had spent too many years listening for things others missed, tracking signals across open land, reading signs in places where there should have been none, and he knew the difference between silence and something hidden inside it. And he stepped closer to the platform, one boot on the worn wood, then the other, ignoring the sharp intake of breath from the crowd as he crossed a line no one else had dared to approach. And someone called out for him to stop. Another warned him to step back, but their words came too late, because Caleb was already there, close enough now to see the fine details of her face, the faint lines near her eyes that did not match her age, the subtle shift of her breathing as he approached, not fear, not quite, but awareness, as if she had been waiting for this moment without knowing what it would look like. And he spoke again, quieter this time, not to the crowd but to her, even though he did not expect an answer. "Can you understand me?" And for a second nothing changed. The air held still, the crowd held its breath, and then her eyes met his fully, not glancing, not passing over him, but locking in place with a clarity that cut through everything else. And she did not speak, not with words, but the slightest tilt of her head carried something unmistakable, recognition, and it was enough to confirm what he had already begun to suspect, that whatever story had been told about her was missing something essential, something that had been ignored because it did not fit the ending they wanted. And Caleb reached slowly, deliberately, toward the device at her throat, giving anyone who might object plenty of time to do so, but no one moved. Not yet, because uncertainty had taken hold and it made them hesitate, made them wait to see what he would do. And his fingers brushed the surface of the object, cool and smooth, unlike anything built by human hands. And as he touched it, the faint vibration grew slightly stronger, enough to feel through his skin, a steady pulse like a heartbeat that did not belong to her alone. And Caleb glanced back at the crowd, meeting the eyes of the man who had spoken before, the one trying to hold everything together. And for a moment neither of them said anything, because both understood that whatever happened next would change the direction of this moment. And Caleb made his choice without asking permission, because permission was just another way to delay the truth. And he unfastened the device in one clean motion, lifting it away from her neck. And the sound that followed was not loud, not dramatic, but it was clear, a low-frequency signal that cut through the air like a distant call carried across miles of empty land. And the girl's shoulders shifted for the first time, a small release, as if something had been lifted from her. And the crowd reacted not with anger now, but with confusion, turning toward one another, searching for someone who could explain what they were hearing. But no explanation came, because none of them had expected this. None of them had considered that the thing they feared might not be a weapon, might not be a threat, might be something else entirely. And Caleb held the device up slightly, listening, feeling the rhythm of it. And he knew, without needing anyone to tell him, that this was not the end of a message. It was the beginning of one, and somewhere beyond the ridge, beyond the reach of their sight, something was responding, something that had been waiting just as long as she had. And for the first time since he stepped into the square, Caleb felt the weight of what was coming settle into place, not as fear, but as understanding, and he looked back at her, standing free now though no one had yet moved to untie her hands. And in that moment the roles had shifted, quietly, completely, because she was no longer the one being judged, and they were no longer the ones in control. The sound did not stop, it stretched outward, thin but steady, like a thread pulled across distance that could not be measured in miles or hours. And every person in that square felt it in a different way, some as a faint vibration under their boots, others as a pressure in the air that made breathing feel just slightly heavier. And Caleb noticed how quickly confusion replaced certainty, how fast a crowd built on shared belief could begin to fracture when something unfamiliar slipped through the cracks, and the man who had been giving orders stepped forward again, trying to gather what remained of his authority, his voice firmer now, but carrying a strain that had not been there before, telling Caleb to hand over the device, telling him that whatever it was did not change what had already been decided. But Caleb did not move, because decisions made too quickly rarely survive the truth, and he turned the object in his hand, watching the faint pulse of light move beneath its surface, not random, not broken, but patterned, deliberate, as if it were speaking in a language no one here had taken the time to learn. And then he did something even quieter than stepping onto the platform, something that almost went unnoticed until it was already done. He reached back and loosened the binding at the girl's wrists, not with urgency, not with defiance, just a simple motion that carried more weight than any argument could, and the rope fell away without resistance, landing softly against the wood, and no one stopped him. Not because they agreed, but because they were no longer sure they were right. And that hesitation held them in place stronger than any command could have, and the girl lowered her hand slowly, as if testing the freedom she had not asked for, but had not resisted either, her fingers flexing slightly in the open air. And then she turned her attention fully to Caleb, not the crowd, not the men who had stood ready to pass judgment, just him. And for a moment the world seemed to narrow to that quiet exchange, something passing between them without words, something that did not need translation. And Caleb nodded once, almost imperceptibly, as if acknowledging a truth that had been there all along. And then he lifted the device again, holding it closer to his ear, focusing on the rhythm beneath the surface. And it shifted, subtly at first, then more clearly, the pulse becoming more frequent, more urgent, not louder but closer. And that was when he understood, not in pieces but all at once, that the signal was not waiting to be found. It had already been found, and whatever was on the other end was moving, closing the distance with a certainty that did not rely on fear or hesitation. And he looked out toward the ridge beyond the settlement, the line where land met sky in a way that made everything beyond it feel distant and unknowable. And for the first time since the moment began, the crowd followed his gaze, their attention shifting away from the platform, away from the girl, towards something they could not yet see but were beginning to feel. And the man beside him spoke again, softer now, asking what it meant, not demanding, not commanding, but asking, because authority had given way to uncertainty. And Caleb did not answer right away, not because he did not know, but because saying it out loud would make it real in a way none of them were ready for. And instead he handed the device back to the girl, placing it gently in her open palm, and she closed her fingers around it with a familiarity that confirmed everything he had begun to piece together. And then, for the first time since she had been brought into that square, she moved with intention, stepping forward, past the place where she had stood bound, past the line where judgment had been waiting, and she turned to face the same horizon as Caleb, lifting the device slightly as if aligning it with something far beyond their reach. And the signal changed again, rising just enough to be heard by more than one pair of ears, a layered tone now, complex, structured, and the air itself seemed to respond, carrying it outward. And one by one, the people in the square fell silent, not because they were told to, but because something larger than their voices had taken hold of the moment. And Caleb stood beside her, not in front, not as a shield, but as someone who had chosen to remain when walking away would have been easier. And he realized then that this was no longer about stopping an execution, no longer about proving a point or challenging a decision. It was about what came next, about what would arrive on the other side of that horizon. drawn by a signal that had never been meant for them, and yet had become their warning all the same. And in that quiet, stretched thin across the land like the signal itself, the truth settled in, not loud, not dramatic, but undeniable, that the girl they had almost silenced had not come here to harm them. She had come here because something else was already on its way. The horizon did not change all at once. It never does, not in places like this where distance has a way of hiding truth until it is almost too late to matter. But something was different now, something subtle that only revealed itself if you kept looking long enough, and Caleb did, his eyes narrowing slightly beneath the brim of his hat as the line where sky met land began to shimmer in a way that had nothing to do with heat or wind, and beside him the girl stood perfectly still again. But this time it was not the stillness of restraint, it was the stillness of purpose, as if she had finally reached the point she had been trying to reach all along. And the device in her hand pulsed stronger now, the rhythm no longer faint or distant but present, immediate, like a heartbeat that had found its echo. And behind them the crowd shifted uneasily, boots scraping against dirt, voices lowered to whispers that carried more fear than the shouting ever had, because fear grows louder in silence. And the man who had once commanded the square stepped closer to Caleb again. But this time he did not issue orders, he asked. Questions, quiet ones, uncertain ones, the kind a man asks when he realizes control was never really his to begin with. And Caleb answered without looking at him, his voice low, steady. It is not coming for her. And that was enough to change everything. Because if it was not coming for her, then it was coming for them. And that realization moved through the crowd faster than any signal could. A ripple of understanding that no one wanted but no one could deny. And someone took a step back. Then another, and the distance between the platform and the people who had filled the square began to grow, not by force but by instinct. Because when something unknown approaches, the first reaction is always the same. Create space, create distance. Even if distance offers no protection at all. And the girl finally spoke, not in words they understood, not in a language shaped for human ears, but in a tone that carried intention clear enough to feel, a soft series of sounds directed at the device, controlled, precise, and the signal shifted again, aligning with her voice, amplifying it, sending it outward in a pattern that no longer sounded like a call for help, but something else, something structured, deliberate, like a message being answered, and Caleb felt it in the air, a change in pressure so slight it might have gone unnoticed if not for the way everything else had gone quiet. Even the wind seemed to pause, holding its breath along with everyone else. And then, far beyond the ridge, something moved, not fast, not sudden, but undeniable, a shape breaking the clean line of the horizon, rising slowly into view with a steadiness that suggested it had never been in a hurry, that it had always known exactly where it was going and when it would arrive. And no one spoke now, not even in whispers, because words would only make it more real, and reality was already settling heavily enough on its own. And Caleb remained where he was, not stepping forward, not stepping back, just standing beside the girl as the distance between what they believed and what was actually happening collapsed into a single moment. And he realized then that this was the part most people never prepared for. Not the fear, not the confrontation, but the understanding that comes after, when the truth does not match the story you have been telling yourself. And the girl lowered the device slightly, her voice fading, her posture easing just enough to suggest that whatever she had been waiting for was now within reach. And Caleb glanced at her, searching for something in her expression, fear, relief, anything that might give him a sense of what would come next. But what he found instead was something quieter, something heavier, a kind of sadness that did not belong to the moment, but to everything that had led up to it. And he understood then, not in full, not completely, but enough to feel the weight of it, that she had not been afraid of them, not truly. She had been afraid of this, of what was coming, of what it would mean for people who had been too busy judging to listen. And behind them someone finally spoke, a single question that cut through the silence with a kind of fragile honesty. What is that? And Caleb did not answer right away, because the answer was already unfolding in front of them, rising above the ridge, growing clearer with each passing second. And whatever it was not hiding, not threatening, not even announcing itself. It was simply arriving, drawn by a signal that had never been meant to be ignored. And as the first clear shape emerged against the sky, casting a shadow that stretched across the land like a line dividing what they had been from what they were about to become, Caleb made a choice without saying it out loud. He stayed where he was, beside the one person who had tried to warn them when no one else would listen. Because out here, when the truth finally shows itself, there is no standing in the middle. You either step away from it, or you stand and face it. And Caleb Ward did not move. The shape did not rush. It did not descend like something hunting or fleeing. It simply grew larger, steady and certain, as if distance itself had been the only thing keeping it hidden. And now that distance was no longer enough, and Caleb could feel the shift ripple through the people behind him, not in sound but in movement, boots dragging back inches at a time, hands lowering from where they had once been ready to act. Because action requires confidence, and confidence had drained from the square the moment the unknown chose to reveal itself, and the girl remained beside him, her posture unchanged, her gaze fixed on the approaching form with a calm that did not come from ignorance, but from familiarity, as if she had seen this before, not here, not with these people, but somewhere far from this place where signals were understood and warnings were not mistaken for threats. And Caleb watched her from the corner of his eye, measuring the distance between fear and acceptance in the way she held herself, and he realized that whatever was coming, she did not expect it to harm her, which meant it had never been meant for her in the first place. And that understanding settled into him with a weight that felt heavier than anything the crowd had brought with them. And behind him a voice broke the silence again, softer now, almost hesitant, asking what they should do, and no one answered right away. Because the truth was simple and difficult all at once, there was nothing left to do but watch. And the man who had once tried to control the moment stood still, his hands no longer raised, his voice gone quiet, as if he too had reached the edge of what he understood and found nothing solid beneath his feet. And the air itself seemed to hum in response to the signal still held loosely in the girl's hand, the device pulsing in time with something far beyond the ridge, something that was no longer distant enough to ignore. And Caleb took a slow breath, the kind that comes when a man knows the next moment will not wait for him to be ready. And he stepped forward just slightly, not toward the shape, but toward the space between it and the people behind him, a subtle shift that placed him not as a leader, not as a shield, but as a witness, someone willing to stand in the open when others chose to step back. And the ground beneath them carried a faint vibration now, not enough to shake, not enough to frighten, but enough to remind them that what was approaching was real, that it occupied the same world they did, even if it did not follow the same rules. And the girl lifted the device again, her fingers steady, her movements precise, and she spoke once more in that quiet, unfamiliar tone, the sound threading into the air and aligning with the deeper signal that had been growing stronger with every passing second. And this time the response came faster, clearer, the distant shape shifting slightly, as if acknowledging her presence, not turning, not stopping, but adjusting in a way that suggested awareness. And Caleb felt a strange sense of recognition in that, not of the thing itself, but of the exchange, the way two points across distance could find each other without needing to see or touch. And he wondered, briefly, how many times she had tried to send that signal before someone finally listened, how long she had stood alone with a message no one wanted to hear. And the answer settled in his chest without words, long enough. And as the shape rose higher, its outline becoming clearer against the sky, the details still indistinct but unmistakably structured, the crowd took another step back as one, not in panic, not in chaos, but in quiet agreement, as if some unspoken understanding had passed between them that this was no longer their moment to control. And Caleb did not look back at them, did not need to, because he could feel the shift in the air, the way fear had changed its shape, no longer directed at the girl, no longer focused on something small and contained, but stretched outward towards something vast and approaching. And that was the difference that mattered, because fear aimed at the wrong thing leads to decisions that cannot be undone. And Caleb had seen enough of those to know their cost. And beside him the girl lowered her hand again, the device still glowing faintly, her expression unchanged but her shoulders easing, just enough to suggest that whatever came next would not be a surprise to her. And that was when Caleb understood the final piece that had been missing, not spoken, not shown, but present in everything she had done. She had never been asking them to save her. She had been asking them to listen, and they almost had not, and the shape in the sky continued its steady approach. No longer a distant shadow, but a presence that filled the horizon, casting a long, quiet shadow across the land that reached all the way to where Caleb and the girl stood. And in that shadow, in that space between what had been and what was coming, Caleb Ward remained still, not because he did not feel the weight of it, but because he did. And out here, when something bigger than fear arrives, the only thing a man can choose is whether he stands or turns away, and he had already made his choice. The shadow reached them before the shape fully revealed itself, stretching long across the ground like a quiet line drawn between what they thought they understood and what was about to prove them wrong. And Caleb felt the temperature shift slightly, not colder, not warmer, just different, like the air itself had decided to pay attention. And beside him the girl did not step back, did not brace. She simply stood there with the device resting lightly in her hand, her gaze steady, as if she had been waiting not for rescue but for arrival. And the people behind them had gone completely still now. No whispers, no movement, just the sound of breathing and the low, steady hum that had grown into something undeniable. And Caleb lifted his eyes again to the horizon, where the form had now risen enough to break cleanly against the sky, its edges no longer blurred by distance but defined by intention, not sharp, not jagged, but smooth in a way that did not belong to anything built by hands used to weight and gravity. And it moved without haste, without hesitation, as if time itself did not press on it the way it pressed on everything else. And that was when the realization settled deeper, heavier, that this was not something arriving late. This was something arriving exactly when it meant to. And Caleb shifted his stance slightly, grounding himself in the dirt beneath his boots, feeling the faint vibration that had become more constant now, not threatening, not aggressive, just present, like a second heartbeat layered beneath his own. And the girl raised the device once more, her fingers steady despite everything that had happened, and she spoke again in that quiet, measured tone, each sound deliberate, each pause intentional. And this time the response was immediate, the hum deepening, aligning with her voice in a way that felt less like an echo and more like an answer. And the shape above seemed to slow, not stopping, but adjusting, as if acknowledging her signal not as a call for help, but as confirmation. And Caleb watched the exchange without interrupting, without questioning, because there are moments when understanding does not come from words, but from watching closely enough to see what others miss. And what he saw now was not an invasion, not a threat, but a meeting, one that had nearly been lost because no one had listened. Soon enough, and behind him someone finally found the courage to speak again, asking if they should run, the words slipping out in a voice that carried more honesty than anything said before. And Caleb shook his head once, slow and certain, not turning to face them, just enough movement to answer without breaking his focus, because running from something you do not understand only ensures you will never understand it. And the girl lowered the device slightly, her shoulders relaxing in a way that had not been possible before. And for the first time there was something new in her expression, not fear, not relief, but recognition that had finally found its place. And she took a small step forward, closing the space between herself and the edge of the platform, as if preparing for what came next. And Caleb did not stop her, did not reach out, because he understood now that she had never been the one in danger. Not truly. She had only been the one standing closest to it. And the shape above shifted again, its surface catching the light in a way that revealed patterns too precise to be random, too complex to be accidental. And the shadow it cast grew deeper, more defined, stretching across the square and touching the edges of every building, every person, as if marking them all equally, not judging, not selecting, just present. And Caleb felt the weight of that, the way something larger than any one person could change the meaning of a place simply by arriving. And he thought, briefly, of how close they had come to silencing the only voice that had understood this moment before it began. And that thought stayed with him, not as regret, but as a reminder, because out here, mistakes are not always loud. Sometimes they are quiet, made in certainty, carried out in silence, and only revealed when it is almost too late to change them. And the girl turned her head slightly toward him again, just for a moment, her eyes meeting his with that same quiet clarity as before. And this time there was something else there, something that did not need translation, acknowledgement. And Caleb gave a small nod in return, not as a command, not as permission, but as recognition of the choice she had made to stand when she could have turned away. And above them the shape continued its descent, slow, deliberate, closing the last stretch of distance not as something forcing its way into their world, but as something that had always been part of it, just beyond their reach. And the hum in the air settled into a steady tone that no longer felt foreign, just unfamiliar. And Caleb stood his ground beside her, not because he knew what would happen next, but because he knew that whatever it was, it deserved to be faced with open eyes. And out here, that was the closest thing to justice a man could offer. The descent slowed until it almost felt like it had stopped, not because it could not continue, but because it chose not to rush the moment. And that choice carried a kind of weight Caleb had only ever seen in people who understood consequences before they acted, and the shape above them now filled more of the sky than the horizon itself, its surface shifting subtly as light moved across it, revealing lines and curves that did not follow any pattern built by human hands. And yet nothing about it felt chaotic, nothing about it felt uncontrolled, and that was what unsettled the crowd the most. Not its size, not its presence, but its calm. Because calm leaves no room for the stories people tell themselves to make sense of fear. And behind Caleb the distance between bodies grew wider, not from panic, but from something quieter, something closer to respect or perhaps realization. And the man who had once tried to lead stepped back fully now, not surrendering, but understanding that whatever authority he believed he held did not extend to this moment. And Caleb did not turn to see it. He felt it in the way the air behind him opened, in the way no one called out anymore, in the way silence had settled like dust after a long ride. And beside him the girl took another small step forward, her boots touching the edge of the platform where shadow met light, and she lifted the device one last time, not as a signal, but as a confirmation, holding it steady in front of her as the hum in the air aligned perfectly with its pulse. And then something changed, not in the crowd, not on the ground, but above, the shape responding with a shift so precise it could not be mistaken for coincidence, a section of its surface adjusting, opening in a way that did not break or separate but unfolded, like something revealing itself rather than exposing a weakness. And the light that emerged was not harsh, not blinding, but soft, carrying a tone that matched the signal exactly. And Caleb felt the connection between the 2 points solidify, no longer distant, no longer uncertain, but complete. And the girl lowered the device slowly, her hand relaxing as if the purpose it had served was finally fulfilled. And for the first time she looked away from the horizon and toward the people behind them, her gaze moving across faces that had once been filled with judgment and were now filled with something else entirely, something heavier, something harder to carry. And she did not speak, not in their language, not in any language they could follow. But the absence of words said more than anything else could have, because it forced them to sit with what they had almost done, to feel the weight of it without distraction. And Caleb watched that moment unfold without stepping in, without softening it, because some truths are meant to settle slowly, to take root where they are needed most. And he knew that no explanation would carry the same weight as what they were already beginning to understand on their own. And the light above extended further, reaching down not as a beam or a force, but as a presence, something that bridged the space between sky and ground without urgency. And the girl stepped into it without hesitation, her figure outlined gently against the glow, not disappearing, not consumed, just held in a way that suggested she belonged there as much as she had ever belonged here. And Caleb remained where he was, just outside its reach, watching closely, not out of fear, but out of respect for something he did not yet fully understand. And he realized then that this was not an ending, not even close. It was a turning point, one that would echo far beyond this square, far beyond this moment, because the line they had crossed was not between safety and danger, but between ignorance and understanding. And those lines, once crossed, do not fade. And the girl turned her head once more, her eyes finding Caleb's again, and this time there was something new in them. Not just acknowledgement, but something closer to gratitude, though it was not for saving her, not for standing beside her, but for listening when no one else had. And Caleb gave the smallest nod in return, the kind that does not ask for recognition or reward, only acceptance of what had been done and what it had meant, and above them the shape held steady, not advancing, not retreating, simply present, as if waiting for the moment to complete itself, and in that stillness, in that quiet space between what had happened and what would come next, Caleb Ward stood with his boots planted firmly in the dust, knowing without needing to say it that sometimes the bravest thing a man can do is not draw his weapon, not raise his voice, but stand still long enough for the truth to reveal itself, and when it does, have the courage not to look away. The light did not pull her upward the way anyone might have expected. It did not lift her feet from the ground or carry her into the sky. Instead, it settled around her like something familiar, something that recognized her presence and chose to meet her where she stood, and that alone changed the way the moment felt, because it was not taking her away, it was reaching toward her, and Caleb could see the difference in the way her shoulders eased, in the way her breathing found a rhythm that matched the steady tone in the air, and for a brief moment the world felt balanced, as if two sides that had been separated for too long had finally found a way to align, and the crowd behind them did not move, not forward, not back. They simply watched, held in place by something deeper than fear, something closer to realization, because what they were seeing could not be forced into the story they had built. It did not fit into the shape of danger or threat or anything they had prepared themselves to face, and that left them with only one option, to see it as it was, without the comfort of certainty, and that is something few people are ever ready for. And Caleb shifted his weight slightly, the dust beneath his boots soft and familiar, grounding him in a moment that felt anything but, and he kept his eyes on her, not because he feared what might happen, but because he understood that whatever came next would not be announced. It would unfold quietly, the way truth always does, when no one is looking for it. And the girl raised her hand slowly within the light, the device still resting in her palm, and for a second it glowed brighter, not with urgency, not with warning, but with completion, like something that had reached the end of its purpose and was ready to become something else. And the tone in the air shifted again, softer now, less like a signal and more like a response settling into place. And Caleb felt the change in his chest, a release of tension he had not realized he was holding, because for the first time since this began, there was no question of what the moment meant, only the question of what it would leave behind. And the girl turned fully toward the crowd then, stepping just slightly out of the center of the light, not leaving it, but not hidden within it either, and her eyes moved slowly across the faces in front of her, taking them in one by one, not with judgment, not with anger, but with something far more difficult to face, understanding. And that was what made several of them lower their gaze, what made others shift uncomfortably where they stood, because it is easier to stand against something you believe is beneath you than it is to meet the eyes of something that chooses not to condemn you at all. And Caleb saw it happen, the moment where certainty gave way to something quieter, something that did not shout or demand or justify itself. It simply existed, and in that existence it forced everything else to adjust. And the man who had once spoken the loudest finally removed his hat, not as a gesture of surrender, not even as apology, but as acknowledgement, a small act that carried more weight than anything he had said before, and no one told him to do it. No one followed immediately, but the shift had begun, and shifts like that do not stop once they find their footing, and above them the shape remained steady, its presence no longer overwhelming but constant, like the sky itself had chosen to come closer without losing its distance. And Caleb realized then that whatever this was, it was not here to take, not here to claim. It was here to answer, and that answer had been waiting on them as much as it had been waiting on her. And the girl lowered her hand completely now, the device dimming as if its voice had finally been heard, and she took one last step forward, out of the light entirely, standing once again on the same ground as everyone else. But nothing about her felt the same, not because she had changed, but because they had, and Caleb watched as she stood there, quiet, steady, no longer bound, no longer judged, just present, and in that presence there was a question, not spoken, not demanded, but offered. What will you do now that you understand? And no one answered right away, because some questions take longer to face than others, and Caleb felt that weight settle into the space around him. Not heavy, not oppressive, but real, and he knew that whatever came next would not be decided by fear or by force. It would be decided by whether or not they chose to remember this moment the way it truly was, and not the way they almost made it. And the wind returned then, gentle, carrying the dust across the ground in soft lines that blurred the edges of where they stood, and Caleb remained still, his gaze steady, his presence quiet, because out here, when everything changes without a single shot fired, the only thing that matters is whether you have the strength to stand in that change and let it become something better. No one spoke because there was nothing left to argue, nothing left to defend, only the quiet weight of what had almost happened settling over them like dust after a long storm, and Caleb could feel it in the way the air had changed, not tense anymore, not sharp, but heavy in a different way, the kind that comes when people begin to see themselves clearly for the first time. And he watched as the man who had removed his hat lowered his gaze further, not in shame alone, but in something deeper. Something that looked like recognition of a line crossed too easily, and around him others followed without being told, small movements, heads dipping, shoulders softening, the kind of shifts that do not need words to carry meaning. And the girl stood among them now without the light surrounding her, without the rope that had once marked her as something to be judged, and yet she did not step away, did not retreat into the safety of the presence above. She remained where she was, on their ground, in their space, as if giving them the chance to meet her not as a threat, not as a mystery, but simply as someone who had tried to speak and had not been heard. And that choice carried more strength than anything else she could have done, and Caleb understood it immediately, because staying is always harder than leaving when you have been misunderstood, and the device in her hand dimmed further, its glow fading to a soft pulse that matched the slower rhythm in the air, as if whatever message it had carried was no longer needed. And above them the shape remained steady, not pressing forward, not demanding attention, just present, waiting in a way that felt patient rather than passive. And Caleb realized that whatever intelligence guided it understood something most people did not, that truth does not need to force itself into a moment. It only needs to arrive and remain long enough to be seen. And the wind shifted again, brushing lightly across the square, lifting small trails of dust that moved between boots and across the worn wood of the platform, softening the edges of what had happened there, but not erasing it, because some marks are meant to stay, not as scars, but as reminders. And the girl took a slow breath, her shoulders rising and falling in a rhythm that now matched the quiet hum above. And then she did something no one expected. She stepped forward, not toward the light, not toward Caleb, but toward the crowd itself, closing the distance that they had instinctively created. And no one stepped back this time. No one raised a hand or turned away. They held their ground, uncertain but willing, and that willingness was new, fragile, but real. And Caleb watched as she stopped just a few feet from the nearest person, close enough that there was no room left for distance to hide behind, and she lifted her hand slightly, palm open, the device resting there like something that had finished its purpose. And though she did not speak in words they could understand, the gesture itself was clear, not an offering, not a demand, but an invitation. And the man closest to her hesitated, his eyes flicking from her face to Caleb and back again, searching for guidance where there was none to give, because this was not a moment that could be led. It had to be chosen, and slowly, almost carefully, he extended his own hand, not fully, not with certainty, but enough to meet her halfway. And when their hands touched, there was no flash, no sound, no visible change, only the quiet contact of two worlds that had almost passed each other by. And that was enough, enough to shift something deeper than fear, something that had been built over time and could only be undone the same way, one moment, one choice at a time. And Caleb felt a weight lift from the space around him, not completely, not all at once, but enough to know that the direction had changed, that the path they were on was no longer leading toward the same ending. And he turned his gaze upward again, toward the presence above, and for a brief moment he thought he saw it respond, not in movement, not in sound, but in stillness, a kind of quiet acknowledgement that what needed to happen here was already happening, and that it did not need to intervene. And that realization stayed with him, because it meant that this moment, fragile as it was, belonged entirely to them, and what they did with it would define everything that followed. And the girl withdrew her hand slowly, not breaking the connection, but completing it. And she looked once more across the faces in front of her, and this time what she saw there was different, not fear, not certainty, but something that had not been present before, understanding beginning to take root. And Caleb stood where he had always stood, between nothing and everything. And he knew without needing to say it that the hardest part was not what had just happened, it was what would come next, because out here, change does not arrive with noise, it arrives quietly. And it asks only one thing in return, that you remember it when it would be easier to forget. The touch lingered long after their hands had separated, not on the skin, but in the space between them, where something invisible had shifted and could not be put back the way it was before, and Caleb saw it ripple outward, slow but certain, as one person glanced at another not with suspicion, but with something closer to curiosity, as if for the first time they were willing to admit they did not know everything they thought they did. And that admission, small as it was, carried more weight than any declaration ever could, because it left room for something new to take root. And the girl stepped back just slightly, not retreating, not withdrawing, but allowing the moment to settle without forcing it further. And that restraint spoke louder than any words she could have tried to offer, because it showed she understood something they were only just beginning to learn. That change cannot be pushed, it has to be chosen. And Caleb shifted his gaze across the crowd, reading the subtle movements, the quiet exchanges, the way certainty had softened into something more careful, more deliberate. And he recognized that look. He had seen it before in places where people realized too late that they had been wrong. And the difference here was that it was not too late, not yet. And above them the presence in the sky remained still, unchanged, as if it had no need to act because the moment had already begun to unfold exactly as it needed to. And that stillness carried its own kind of authority, not one built on force or control, but on patience, the kind that waits for understanding to catch up rather than dragging it forward. And the wind moved again, lighter now, carrying with it the scent of dust and dry earth, familiar things that grounded the moment in something real, something human. And Caleb took a slow breath, feeling that familiarity settle into him, reminding him that no matter how far beyond their understanding this moment reached, it was still happening here, in a place shaped by choices, by people, by the way they chose to see each other. And the girl looked down briefly at the device in her hand, its glow now faint, almost gone, and then she did something that no one had expected. She extended it outward, not toward the sky, not toward Caleb, but toward the same man who had first reached out to her, offering it with the same open palm, the same quiet invitation. And the man hesitated again, but less this time, his hand rising more steadily as he accepted it, his fingers closing carefully around something he did not understand but was no longer afraid to hold. And Caleb watched that exchange with a quiet sense of recognition, because trust does not arrive fully formed. It builds in moments like this, where risk is small, but meaning is not. And the man looked down at the device in his hand, turning it slightly, feeling its weight, its warmth. And then he looked back at her, and though he did not speak, something in his expression shifted, something that did not need words to carry its meaning. And the girl gave a small nod, not as approval, not as instruction, but as acknowledgement that the step had been taken, and that was enough. And behind him others leaned forward slightly, not in aggression, not in fear, but in interest, as if the boundary that had once separated them from her had begun to dissolve, replaced by something less rigid, less defined. And Caleb felt the balance of the moment settle into place, not perfect, not complete, but stable enough to hold. And he realized that this was the point where everything could still go either way, where understanding could deepen or retreat, depending on what they chose next. And he knew that no words from him would shape that choice. No action could force it, because it did not belong to him. It belonged to them, to the people who had stood ready to judge and were now being asked, without being told, to reconsider. And above them the shape remained, not pressing closer, not fading away, simply present, a silent witness to what unfolded below. And Caleb wondered, briefly, if it had always been this way, if something beyond their understanding had always been watching, waiting to see what they would do when faced with something different, something unfamiliar, something that did not fit into the stories they told themselves. And if this was the moment that answered that question. And the girl stepped back again, creating space once more, her role in the moment shifting from center to something quieter, something that allowed the focus to move where it needed to, and Caleb remained where he was, neither stepping forward nor back, because he understood that sometimes the most important thing a person can do is hold their ground long enough for others to find theirs. And in the quiet that followed, in the space where no one rushed to fill the silence, something settled, something that would not be easily undone, and though no one said it out loud, though no one needed to, the truth of the moment had taken hold, and it would stay there, in the dust, in the air, in the memory of everyone who stood there, long after the light above chose to move on, and Caleb Ward knew that when it did, what remained would matter far more than what had arrived. The moment did not break, it deepened, settling into something quieter, something more permanent than the tension that had come before, and Caleb could feel it in the way no one rushed to speak, in the way even the smallest movements seemed deliberate now, as if everyone understood that what they did next would carry forward long after this day ended. And the man holding the device looked down at it once more, then slowly lifted his gaze to the girl, and this time there was no hesitation, no searching for permission, just a simple, steady awareness that he was part of something larger than himself, and he took a step back, not away from her, but into the space he had once helped fill with judgment, creating room where there had been none before, and others followed, not because they were told to, but because they saw the shift and recognized it for what it was, a chance to choose differently. And Caleb watched it unfold without interfering, his presence quiet, his role already fulfilled in the only way that mattered. He had stayed when others would have stepped aside, and now the rest belonged to them, and the girl remained. Still for a moment longer, her eyes moving across the crowd one last time, not counting them, not measuring them, just seeing them, and then she turned back toward the open sky, toward the presence that had waited without forcing, and for a brief second the device in the man's hand pulsed again, a faint echo of what it had been, and he looked at it with something like understanding, then extended his arm slowly, offering it back, not because he had been told to, but because he knew it did not belong to him, and she stepped forward to take it, their hands meeting once more certain this time, more grounded, and when she closed her fingers around it the light above shifted slightly, not brighter, not closer, but in a way that felt like acknowledgement, and Caleb felt a quiet sense of completion settle into the air, the kind that does not announce itself, but is understood all the same, and the girl stepped back again, turning fully toward the horizon, her posture steady, her purpose clear, and the presence above responded, not with movement at first, but with a soft change in the tone that filled the space, a gentle easing, like a held breath finally released. And then, slowly, almost imperceptibly, it began to rise, not retreating in haste, not disappearing, but lifting with the same calm certainty with which it had arrived, and the shadow that had stretched across the land began to pull back, inch by inch, releasing the ground beneath it, returning the light in a way that felt earned rather than given, and the people in the square watched without speaking, without reaching, because they understood now that some things are not meant to be held, only witnessed. And Caleb stood where he had always stood, his eyes following the movement above, not out of curiosity anymore, but out of respect, because he knew that what had happened here would not be repeated the same way again, not for him, not for them. And the girl remained facing the sky until the presence had lifted far enough that its edges softened back into distance, until the hum in the air faded into something barely noticeable. And then she lowered her head slightly, not in sorrow, not in relief, but in something that felt like closure, and she turned back toward the square, toward the people who had almost chosen a different ending. And for a moment no one moved, no one spoke, because there was nothing left that needed to be said, and Caleb felt the weight of that silence settle into something solid, something that would stay long after the dust had settled and the sky had returned to its familiar emptiness, and he knew, without needing to ask, that every person standing there would carry this moment with them, not as a story to tell, but as a question to remember. And the girl stepped down from the platform fully now, her boots touching the same ground as everyone else, and she did not hurry, did not look back. She simply began to walk, not away, not toward anything in particular, just forward, as if the path ahead did not need to be chosen yet. only taken one step at a time, and Caleb watched her go for a moment, then shifted his gaze to the others, seeing the same quiet understanding reflected back at him, and in that shared silence, in that space where no one tried to reclaim what had been lost, something new took hold, something that did not need to be named to exist, and out here, that was enough. The dust settled slowly after she began to walk, each step she took soft against the ground, unhurried, unafraid, and no one moved to stop her, no one called after her, because there was nothing left to take from her and nothing left to give that had not already been offered in silence. And Caleb watched her for a few seconds longer than the others, not out of curiosity, but out of understanding, because he knew that sometimes the most important moments do not end with a clear line. They fade into something quieter, something that stays with you long after the sound is gone. And behind him the crowd remained where they were, not gathering, not dispersing, just standing in that shared space where something had changed and none of them quite knew how to return to what they had been before. And the man who had once spoken the loudest lowered his hat back onto his head, but not the same way as before, not with authority or certainty, but with care, as if even that small motion carried meaning now. And another man turned, slightly, looking toward the empty sky where the presence had been, his eyes narrowing not in suspicion but in thought, as if trying to understand something that could not be explained in simple terms. And Caleb took a slow breath, letting the air fill his lungs, grounding himself again in the weight of the land beneath his feet, because no matter how far the moment had reached beyond them, it had still happened here, on this ground, among these people, shaped by the choices they had made and the ones they had almost made, and that mattered, more than anything that had come from the sky, more than any signal or light, because it meant the difference between repeating the same mistake and choosing something better the next time. And the girl continued walking, her figure growing smaller against the wide stretch of open land, not disappearing, just becoming part of the horizon the way everything eventually does. And Caleb knew without needing to follow that her path did not belong to them, not anymore. It never really had, and that understanding did not carry regret, only clarity. And behind him someone finally spoke, not loudly, not to command attention, but quietly, almost to themselves, asking what they had almost done. And no one answered, because the question did not need an answer. It needed to be remembered, and that was harder, far harder than speaking it out loud. And Caleb turned slightly then, not fully away from the direction she had gone, but enough to face the others, his eyes moving across them one by one, seeing the same thing in each face, not fear, not pride, but reflection, and that was enough. Enough to know that the moment had taken hold where it needed to, that it would stay long enough to matter. And he gave a small nod, not to anyone in particular, not as a signal or a command, just a quiet acknowledgement that what had needed to happen had happened. And then he stepped off the platform, his boots hitting the dirt with a soft, familiar sound, the kind that belongs to ordinary moments, to days that come and go without leaving marks. And yet this one would. He knew that without question. And as he walked past the people who had stood ready to judge, none of them stopped him. None of them spoke, but a few shifted slightly to make space, not out of fear, not out of respect in the way they might have shown it before, but out of something more honest, something that did not need a name. And Caleb moved through them without hurry, without looking back, because he did not need to see what came next. He had already seen enough to understand it. And the wind picked up again, stronger now, carrying the dust across the square, softening the lines of footprints, blurring the edges of where people had stood, but not erasing them completely, because some things are meant to remain, not as proof, but as reminders of where a path could have gone and did not. And as he reached the edge of the square, Caleb paused for just a moment, his gaze lifting toward the horizon where she had walked. And though she was nearly out of sight now, there was no sense of loss in it, only a quiet understanding that some stories are not meant to be followed, only witnessed at the moment they choose to cross your path. And then he turned away, not because it was over, but because it had already given what it needed to give, and the rest would belong to those who chose to remember. And behind him the square remained, quieter than it had ever been, not empty, but changed. And in that change, in that stillness where no one rushed to fill the silence, something new began to take root, something that would not show itself all at once, but would grow in the choices made afterward, in the way they spoke, in the way they listened, in the way they looked at the next stranger who did not fit the story they expected. And out here, that was how real change began, not with noise, not with force, but with a single moment that no one could forget, even if they tried. By the time the sun began to lower itself toward the far edge of the land, the square no longer felt like the same place it had been that morning, not because anything had been rebuilt or repaired, but because something unseen had shifted in the people who stood there. And Caleb Ward knew from experience that those were the changes that lasted the longest, the ones that did not announce themselves but settled deep, shaping decisions in ways no one could trace back to a single moment. And he walked slowly along the edge of the town, his boots pressing into the dry earth with a steady rhythm, the kind that matched thought more than movement. And he did not look back again, not because he had forgotten, but because he understood that what mattered now was not what had happened, but what would be remembered. And memory has a way of choosing its own shape depending on the person who carries it. And behind him, in the square he had left, the people began to move again, not all at once, not with purpose, but in small, quiet ways, some turning toward their homes, others lingering just a moment longer, as if trying to hold on to something they could not quite name. And the man who had first reached out stood where he was for a while, the place where his hand had met hers still marked only by dust and light. And then he bent down slowly, brushing his fingers across the ground as if expecting to find something left behind. But there was nothing there, nothing visible, nothing he could carry away except the understanding that had settled into him. And he straightened again, his shoulders no longer carrying the same tension. And he turned, walking back into the life he had known, though not as the same man who had stood there before. And that was how it spread, not through words or stories, but through the way people carried themselves afterward, the way they paused before speaking, the way they listened just a little longer than they used to. And Caleb could sense it even as he moved further away. Because change like that does not stay contained. It moves quietly, carried in gestures, in silence, in the space between what is said and what is understood, and out beyond the town, where the land opened wide and the horizon stretched unbroken. The girl continued her path, her figure now just a small outline against the fading light. And there was no sound to mark her passing, no signal left in the air, only the steady rhythm of her steps and the quiet certainty of where she was going. And Caleb did not need to follow to know that her journey would not circle back here, that whatever had brought her to that moment had already been fulfilled, and that knowledge did not carry loss, only a kind of respect, because some paths are meant to cross only once, long enough to change direction, and then continue on their own. And he paused briefly at the edge of a ridge, his eyes lifting to the sky where nothing remained of what had once filled it, only the same wide expanse of blue and gold that had always been there. And yet it felt different now, not because it had changed, but because he had. And that was the part most people never understood, that the world does not need to become something new for everything to feel different. Sometimes it is enough for one moment to show you what you had not been seeing. And Caleb stood there for a while, letting that settle, not searching for answers, not trying to name what had happened, just allowing it to exist without needing to be explained. And then he adjusted the brim of his hat slightly, a small, familiar gesture that grounded him back into the rhythm of his own life. And he began to walk again, his path leading him away from the town, away from the place where a decision had almost been made and then quietly undone. And as he moved, the sound of his steps blended with the wind, with the land, with everything that had been there long before him and would remain long after. And somewhere behind him, in the memory of those who had stood in that square, the moment would stay, not as a story of what had happened, but as a question that would return when it mattered most, when they faced something unfamiliar again, when fear tried to speak louder than understanding. And maybe, just maybe, they would remember the girl who did not speak their language but still managed to be heard, and the man who did not raise his voice but still changed the outcome. And in that memory, in that quiet space where choice meets consequence, something better would take root, not because it was forced, not because it was taught, but because it had been seen. And once something is truly seen, it cannot be unseen. And out here, under a sky that holds more than it reveals, that is how justice finds its way, not through noise or power, but through the quiet courage to stand still long enough for the truth to arrive, and when it does, to choose not to turn away.